Now, the 10th Conference on Climate Change and Development in Africa, held under the theme Just Transitioned in Africa, Transforming Dialogue into Action, aims to launch a continent-wide debate on the action required to bring about a transition that is truly just for Africa. Now, for more details on this, I'm joined via Zoom by Mr. James Morumbeti, who is the Chief of African Climate Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Mr. Morumbeti, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Ndapewa. Thank you for your.
All right. Now, first things first, does Africa has a framework in place that specifically looks at climate change and its effects?
Yes, Africa has in climate change, in Africa Union climate change and resilient development strategy, as well as an action plan for the 10 years from 2022 to 2032. This plan of action has been in development for some years now and was adopted by the Committee of African Heads of State on climate change earlier this year and is already under implementation.
All right. Now, how imperative is this framework, especially given that the effects of climate change have threatened the life and the food security in some parts of Africa?
It is quite an important document. It is a strategic plan which is designed to actually address the impacts of climate change on the continent, but also to guide climate action by the different African countries. It aims to guide the continent to take advantage of the opportunities created by climate change and related to the transition to low emissions development and green economies. But it also provides a continental framework for collective action and cooperation in addressing climate impacts on the continent. And in that regard, it defines the main priorities as well as interventions and actions that are required to build resilient economies in Africa. And so in that sense, it is really a very important framework document to guide climate actions at both the continental level, but also at national and sub-national levels in African countries.
All right. Now, Mr. Morumbeti, looking at the global climate change framework, working for Africa and its cognizance of the continent needs, or does it dispose it, and what needs to be done, to ensure that the focus are having, a positive impact on Africa?
So the climate response itself, global, is framed in the context of Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement itself is actually informed by climate science. It is a response to reports that are produced periodically by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which assesses the status of the climate system, the impacts of the changes in the climate system on temperature and precipitation, and the responses that are required in order to regulate the impacts of the climate system. And the climate change strategy for Africa is also responding to the framework that is set up by the Paris Agreement and attempting to put in place mechanisms to guide African actions to implement the recommended actions of the Paris Agreement. In this regard, it defines the climate change challenges that are facing the continent, but also develops a framework for responding to those challenges. And this framework then guides the further development of our national responses. As you are aware, all countries who are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have developed nationally determined contributions, which are really strategies on how each country is going to implement climate responses within its own jurisdiction, but also defines how that climate change strategy is going to be financed, how it is going to utilize existing resources nationally, but also internationally, and what impacts it expects to get from those national climate actions. Collectively, the nationally determined contributions are designed to lead to a situation where all of the mitigation and adaptation actions of different countries are going to control global temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade. And if that happens, then that is going to avoid irreversible interference with the climate system.
Now let's talk about the conference. I understand it's on climate change and the development on Africa, and how the conference aims to create a dialogue. Briefly speak to us about some of the conversations that will be have in order to fast track the climate change interventions.
So this conference is actually convening a broad spectrum of stakeholders from the African continent, including policymakers, public policymakers in the private sector, academics and researchers, African civil society, representatives of youth and women organizations. And as you said at the beginning, the theme under which these stakeholders are being convened is on just transitions in Africa. And the intention is for the conference to contribute towards thinking about how we can move from dialogue, from discussions, from debates about just transitions to actual implementation of actions which is going to result in or which is going to inform how just transitions in the energy sector, in the agriculture sector, in adaptation to climate change, in mitigation, and so on, are going to be implemented in ways which do not compromise Africa's own development potential, in ways which do not put Africa back in a situation where it is constrained by structural relations, but also in ways which are going to take advantage of the different opportunities of the climate response to accelerate the continent's sustainable development.
Now, when we talk about climate change interventions, it can be quite costly. Now, how can African countries upscale their economies and finances when it comes to climate change?
Now, this is a very important topic, how to finance climate actions. And it has actually been one of the most problematic aspects of the global framework that is guiding climate response. Again, the climate response is really divided into actions such as mitigation and adaptation. But for those actions to be implemented, particularly for Africa and other developing countries, what is required is means of implementation. So, in order to implement these climate actions, our continent requires support in terms of finance, but also in terms of capacity building. And these are different capacities, such as capacities, for instance, to study, analyze weather and climate information, capacities to design interventions, capacities to make changes in the way that infrastructure is developed and implemented, and so on. And this also requires financing. Now, the challenge has been that from the beginning, the intention has been for developed countries to provide support to developing countries to implement their climate actions, starting with the Conference of Parties to the UNF Convention on Climate Change in Copenhagen back in 2009. A pledge was made to make available the sum of $100 billion US dollars a year to support climate actions in developing countries. This pledge was recommitted in the Paris Agreement in 2015. But since the Copenhagen Conference of Parties, the amount that is made available by developed countries has not reached the figure that has been pledged, the $100 billion a year. And there are many reasons why this is the case, but it has made it very difficult for the continent to implement the ambitious climate actions that have been proposed by the African member states. Now, as a result of the challenges of mobilizing public resources to finance climate action, there is an increasing innovative climate finance options, including engaging the private sector in mobilizing climate finance, but also including implementing the provisions of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which make it possible to use market-based mechanisms, for instance, around carbon trading to mobilize further finance to support climate action. Our organization, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, for instance, has been working with African governments to develop innovative mechanisms to finance their own climate actions. Innovative mechanisms such as debt for climate swaps, innovative mechanisms such as assisting African countries to develop the carbon credit registry, which is going to ensure high efficacy, high standard carbon credits for the carbon markets. And if the continent can trade in the carbon markets at a certain minimum level of a minimum cost per ton of carbon, then that can be a very creative and sustainable source of financing climate actions. And of course, we need to think about how we can have blended finance to support the climate actions of our countries. So there are quite a number of innovative approaches that are being developed that are at various stages of development or implementation. We are also working to support African countries to improve or to get improved access to existing global climate funds, such as finance from the Green Climate Fund or from the Global Environment Facility. And Namibia is actually a leader in, for instance, securing green climate financing to support adaptation initiatives in the natural resources management sector. There are very important lessons to be learned from the Namibian experience, and this is one of the things that we are looking forward to in this conference.
Betsy, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for it.
All right, that was James Murabeti, who is the Chief of African Climate Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, talking to us about the 10th Conference on Climate Change and Development in Africa. Don't go anywhere. When we come back,